On August 14, 1846, census taker John L. Moyer entered Hancock County, Tennessee, tasked with recording every family, every farm, and every individual for the official federal record. His instructions, like those of all census workers in antebellum America, were explicit. Identify each person by age, sex, and occupation, and most importantly by race. The classifications were rigid: white, black, or mulatto. No further nuance was permitted. But on that sweltering summer afternoon, as Moyer climbed into the remote hollows near Newman's Ridge, he encountered families who did not fit any of those categories. The Collinses, the Gibsons, the Goinses, clusters of kin with dark hair, olive-toned skin, and gray or blue eyes that startled against complexions neither pale nor dark. Moyer recorded them as free persons of color, the only designation the law allowed. But in the margins of his own notebook, he scribbled a private note: "These people are neither Negro nor Indian, nor wholly white, strange mixture." That single moment would echo across generations. In a society built upon the hierarchy of race, these families embodied ambiguity that could not be easily contained. Their very existence threatened the racial order, and from that point forward, they would be marked not only as outsiders, but as objects of suspicion. The term used to describe them, Melungeon, was already whispered in surrounding counties. Its origins are debated. Some scholars trace it to the French mélange, meaning mixture. Others believe it came from the Arabic Melungeon, cursed soul. In either case, it was not a name they claimed for themselves but one imposed from the outside, a word laced with stigma. Court records from the same decade reveal how quickly the label became weaponized. Families identified as Melungeon were denied the right to vote on grounds that they were not white. Property deeds were challenged. School boards turned away their children. The Collins family, one of the largest lineages, fought repeated legal battles simply to prove they belonged to the category that protected civil rights. They often lost. For John L. Moyer, the 1846 census entry was one among hundreds he filed that summer. For the Melungeons, however, it marked the beginning of decades of surveillance, erasure, and forced classification by a society unwilling to accept their complexity. The investigation revealed how fragile racial boundaries were in 19th century America, and how much violence institutions deployed to preserve them. Census records were not neutral documents. They were tools of power, deciding who could own land, who could attend school, who could marry, and who was cast out as other. Years later, local historian Will Allen Drangel, writing in the 1890s, would sensationalize the Melungeons as a mysterious race of people, neither white nor black, neither red nor yellow. Her words cemented their status as curiosities rather than citizens. But the process of marginalization had already begun with those early census takers, whose pens codified uncertainty into stigma. Medical records from the mid-19th century add another layer to this first point of contact. Physicians called to Melungeon communities often noted unusual appearances: children with lighter hair but darker complexions, adults with features that defied simple categorization. In an era obsessed with racial purity, doctors speculated about degeneracy, fueling public suspicion. What they did not record were the grinding realities of poverty, isolation, and systemic exclusion that shaped Melungeon life. This initial encounter, between census taker and community, set into motion a century of erasure. Instead of being documented as what they were, families, farmers, citizens, they were recorded as anomalies. And that bureaucratic act, small on its surface, rippled outward into schoolhouses, courthouses, and churches, where the designation Melungeon became synonymous with stigma. For descendants, the memory of that 1846 census is not merely a historical footnote. It is a reminder of how state institutions, through the stroke of a pen, could transform human lives into categories of exclusion. And it is here that we begin this investigation. A community erased, pathologized, and misunderstood. A people forced to survive in the margins of history. If you want to see how hidden communities like the Melungeons were erased from America's story, subscribe now and stay with us until the end. Leave a comment saying where you are watching from so we know who follows these untold histories. Share this story so others can understand the erased bloodlines of America. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place of both refuge and confinement. Stretching from the Blue Ridge of Virginia into the hollows of eastern Kentucky and Tennessee, their geography created natural barriers that shaped entire lives. For those who wished to escape the reach of society, whether by choice or by force, the ridges offered concealment. It was here, in these secluded valleys, that the Melungeons carved out their survival. By the late 18th century, records already noted their presence in Virginia's frontier counties. Families with surnames like Collins, Gibson, Goins, Minor, and Mullins appear in court minutes, tax ledgers, and land deeds. In many instances, officials attached racial qualifiers to their names: free-colored, mulatto, or of mixed blood. Others were marked ambiguously, sometimes as white, other times as non-white, depending on who held the pen. The inconsistency reflected society's uncertainty, but the consequences were real. Classification determined whether a man could vote, own property, or testify in court. Oral tradition provides a counterpoint to the cold precision of official documents. Stories passed down among Melungeon descendants spoke of ancestors who were Portuguese sailors shipwrecked along the Carolina coast, or Turkish prisoners abandoned after early colonial wars. Other tales connected them to the Saponi and Cherokee tribes, or to Africans who gained freedom long before the Civil War. Each version contained elements of truth. The investigation revealed, through later genealogical work, that the Melungeons were indeed a product of multiple migrations: displaced native families, European indentured servants, and free Africans who moved into the frontier margins where legal oversight was weakest. Isolation shaped identity. Unlike plantation society to the east or coal towns to the west, Melungeon settlements were scattered, their cabins perched along ridges and tucked into narrow hollows. Their neighbors often lived miles away, and contact with the outside world was sporadic. What began as survival, avoiding hostile laws and racial persecution, slowly hardened into a culture of endogamy, where marriage partners were chosen from within the same small group. Land was often kept in the family, passed from father to son, cousin to cousin. Travelers through the region in the early 1800s left written impressions. Some described the Melungeons as industrious farmers, cultivating corn and tobacco on steep slopes. Others, less charitable, painted them as shiftless or uncivilized, language that carried the weight of prejudice. Church minutes reveal tensions. Petitions objecting to Melungeon membership, citing mixed blood as grounds for exclusion. In a society obsessed with racial purity, even the suspicion of mixture could condemn an entire family. The mountains themselves enforced a kind of confinement. Roads were poor, rivers treacherous, winters long and punishing. In the most isolated hollows, children grew up rarely seeing outsiders. Education was minimal. Literacy rates remained low, not out of inability but because schoolhouses refused them. As one later descendant recalled, "Our people lived between two worlds. Not black enough to be accepted by one, not white enough for the other. So we made our own world in the hills." Medical records from the late 19th century hint at the costs of this isolation. Doctors who treated Melungeon families often noted recurring health issues: high rates of anemia, respiratory conditions, and congenital anomalies. These were not simply the products of genetics but also of poverty and inaccessibility. Malnutrition and untreated illness compounded generationally. Yet despite such challenges, families endured, passing down land, oral history, and resilience in equal measure. The investigation revealed that geography was both shield and prison. The Appalachian hollows gave the Melungeons anonymity when racial laws tightened elsewhere. But the same terrain that kept them hidden also confined them to poverty, poor health, and perpetual suspicion. They were marked as different by outsiders, and over time they came to bear that mark not only in how others saw them, but in how they saw themselves. For the Collins family of Newman's Ridge, this meant generations of marriages among cousins. For the Goins family in neighboring Virginia, it meant carrying surnames that appeared in both white and colored registries, never stable, always contested. For children, it meant knowing from the earliest age that school doors could be closed to them for reasons they did not understand. Isolation built the foundation of the Melungeon identity. It preserved them as a distinct people, while simultaneously ensuring that myths and suspicions about them multiplied in the outside world. They became a mirror onto which society projected fears of racial mixing, degeneration, and social disorder. It is here, in these mountains, where the mystery of the Melungeons truly begins, not as an exotic story of foreign sailors or lost tribes, but as a lived reality of families forced into the margins, carrying their bloodlines forward in silence. The census may have been the first bureaucratic encounter, but it was the courtroom that cemented the Melungeons' precarious place in American society. In the 1840s and 1850s, across Virginia and Tennessee, families bearing surnames like Collins, Gibson, and Goins found themselves summoned before county judges to defend not only their rights, but their very identities. In an era where race was law, classification was destiny. The right to vote, to own property, to send children to school, even to serve as a witness in a trial, each of these depended on being legally white. Anything less meant exclusion. For the Melungeons, whose ancestry was ambiguous, the courtroom became a site of both judgment and humiliation. One of the earliest recorded cases comes from Scott County, Virginia in 1846. The Collins family attempted to exercise their right to vote. Their neighbors contested the ballots, arguing that Collins' blood was tainted with color and therefore ineligible. The court proceedings were brutal in their scrutiny. Witnesses were called to testify about skin tone, hair texture, and family rumors stretching back generations. In the absence of scientific evidence, race was decided by hearsay, prejudice, and the subjective gaze of those already in power. The ruling was swift. The Collinses were declared free persons of color and stripped of the vote. Court minutes preserve the cold phrasing devoid of compassion, yet its impact was devastating. For the Collins family, one decision erased their civic voice. For the community, it reinforced the message: ambiguity would not be tolerated. Similar cases echoed across the region. In Hancock County, Tennessee, the Gibson family faced challenges to their land ownership. Neighbors petitioned the court to seize property on grounds that the Gibsons were not legally white and therefore could not hold title. The investigation revealed the cruel logic of the time. If one drop of African ancestry could be suggested, no matter how distant, no matter how unproven, the entire family could be stripped of rights. Medical testimony was occasionally introduced, but not to clarify, it was to condemn. Physicians described complexion, facial structure, and even the shape of ears as evidence of Negro mixture. The courts accepted such testimony as fact. Science, law, and prejudice merged into a single tool of exclusion. In one particularly revealing case, a school board argued that Melungeon children could not be educated alongside whites. Their reasoning, recorded in a petition from Lee County, Virginia, was that such children carried taint of blood that would degrade the morals of white students. The result was stark. Melungeon children were either excluded entirely or forced into segregated, underfunded schools. Literacy, already hindered by isolation, was now systematically denied. The investigation revealed a chilling consistency. Wherever the Melungeons sought to claim rights, whether in voting booths, land registries, or schoolhouses, they were met with suspicion, challenged in court, and too often defeated. Their opponents needed no hard proof. The whisper of ancestry, the shade of skin, the rumor of intermarriage was enough. Newspapers amplified these legal decisions, framing the Melungeons as an anomalous people whose very presence destabilized racial order. Reports described them as neither white nor Negro, a troublesome mixture, echoing courtroom language into the public sphere. What began as legal marginalization soon hardened into cultural myth. The courts did not simply adjudicate disputes, they constructed identities. By classifying Melungeons as non-white, judges effectively wrote their exclusion into law, erasing centuries of mixed ancestry in favor of rigid categories. Entire family trees were reduced to a single label. Years later, descendants would look back on these court cases as turning points. Property lost, voting rights stripped, education denied. Each verdict pushed Melungeon families deeper into isolation. What might have been a community integrated into the broader fabric of Appalachia instead became one defined by stigma, poverty, and suspicion. The legacy of these rulings endures in documents preserved in courthouse archives, where family names are listed alongside racial classifications decided not by truth, but by prejudice. Each faded page is a record of how law was used not to protect, but to erase. The Melungeons' fate in the mid-19th century was sealed not in blood, but in ink, the signatures of judges who declared them outsiders in the land they had lived for generations. By the late 19th century, the Melungeons had moved from court dockets into the pages of folklore and pseudoscience. Where judges once debated their legal status, journalists and anthropologists now speculated on their very origins. The result was a narrative that transformed flesh and blood families into a mystery race, a spectacle to be studied, written about, and feared. The most infamous of these accounts came from Will Allen Dromgoole, a Tennessee journalist and novelist. In the 1890s, she published a series of articles describing the Melungeons as a shiftless, degraded people, the remnants of some strange mixture of blood. Her words, printed in newspapers across the South, cemented the idea of the Melungeons as exotic and degenerate. Dromgoole claimed they descended from Portuguese sailors marooned on the American coast, intermarried with Native Americans and Africans. She painted their hollows as places of poverty, incest, and decline. The investigation revealed that Dromgoole's reporting was less journalism than invention. She relied on rumor, not records. Yet her words carried immense influence. Schools and local governments cited her descriptions to justify exclusion. Families whose surnames appeared in her articles found themselves branded for generations. At the same time, early anthropologists brought their measuring tools into the Appalachian hollows. The emerging science of anthropometry, the study of skull shape, facial angles, and body proportions, was deployed to categorize Melungeons. Researchers took calipers to foreheads, noses, and jaws, reducing individuals to numbers. Their findings, published in academic journals, declared the Melungeons a degenerate hybrid, evidence of racial mixture that, in the language of the time, proved the dangers of crossing racial lines. Medical records of the era mirrored this prejudice. Doctors who treated Melungeon families frequently noted their peculiar appearance in case notes, often linking common illnesses to supposed racial degeneration. In one 1898 medical report from Southwest Virginia, a physician described a child with anemia as the consequence of mixed and impure stock. Such language pathologized ancestry itself, turning the body into evidence of contamination. Folklore compounded the stigma. Neighbors told stories of Melungeons with supernatural origins, descendants of the cursed tribe of Cain, or of ancient wanderers who had hidden in the mountains since biblical times. These tales, passed from pulpit to porch, framed the community as outside not only society but God's order. The investigation revealed how folklore and pseudoscience worked hand in hand, reinforcing each other until myth seemed indistinguishable from fact. The Melungeons themselves fought back in the only way they could, through narrative survival. Many adopted the explanation that they were of Portuguese descent. This claim, though historically imprecise, offered a shield. Portuguese ancestry, while foreign, was categorized as European and therefore white. By declaring themselves Portuguese, Melungeons attempted to reclaim social standing, to pass beyond the reach of laws designed to segregate. Oral history confirms how often families used this explanation in legal disputes, school petitions, and marriage licenses. But even this survival strategy was weaponized. Judges mocked such claims as fictions of a tainted people. Newspapers derided them as Portuguese, a slur meant to strip dignity from the defense. The more Melungeons attempted to define themselves, the more society insisted on defining them as other. The investigation revealed the tragic irony. While the court stripped them of rights, folklore and pseudoscience stripped them of humanity. They were no longer neighbors or farmers, fathers or daughters. They became an object lesson, a case study, a warning about the dangers of racial mixing. And yet, within the hollows, life went on. Families farmed, married, baptized their children, buried their dead. Oral traditions carried the truth of endurance, even as the outside world spun tales of mystery. The Melungeons survived not because society accepted them, but because they persisted in spite of rejection. By the turn of the 20th century, the name Melungeon had hardened into insult. To be called such was to be branded with shame. Schoolchildren hurled it as a slur. Courtrooms used it as justification for exclusion. The stain of the word was so deep that many descendants denied it for generations. Yet the legacy of this era, of folklore and pseudoscience, cannot be erased. It demonstrates how narratives, once entrenched, shape reality. The Melungeons were not degraded because of inherent weakness. They were degraded because society chose to mark them as such, and because myths were easier to believe than truths. Isolation is both a shelter and a trap. For the Melungeons of Appalachia, it was the defining condition of life. Their hollows shielded them from the full force of racial laws, but they also confined them to cycles of poverty, endogamy, and illness that would ripple across generations. By the late 19th century, census records show clusters of Melungeon families in Hancock County, Tennessee, Lee County, Virginia, and Magoffin County, Kentucky. Their names repeat across documents: Collins, Gibson, Goinses, Minor, Mullins. Land was typically inherited rather than purchased, passed within the community, reinforcing both kinship ties and geographic boundaries. Few outsiders moved in. Fewer Melungeons moved out. The investigation revealed a clear pattern. Marriages most often occurred within a narrow circle of cousins and neighbors. This was not cultural preference alone, it was necessity. Outsiders shunned Melungeon families, and laws discouraged unions across racial categories. When communities are forced into themselves, endogamy becomes survival. But it also comes at a cost. Medical records from the early 20th century document unusual concentrations of certain conditions within Melungeon settlements. Physicians in Appalachia noted cases of familial Mediterranean fever, congenital anomalies, and high rates of anemia. One doctor, writing in 1913, described a Melungeon child born with polydactyly, extra fingers, a rare anomaly more common in isolated populations. Others recorded disproportionately high infant mortality, stillbirths, and respiratory illnesses. The connection between isolation and health was not immediately understood. At the time, most doctors framed these conditions as evidence of racial degeneration. But the investigation revealed that these patterns mirrored other endogamous communities worldwide, from European mountain villages to island settlements. It was not mystery. It was genetics, compounded by poverty and poor access to medical care. Living conditions exacerbated the problem. Many Melungeon families resided in cabins of rough-hewn logs, with dirt floors and little ventilation. Water was drawn from springs or shallow wells, often contaminated. Winters were brutal. Children lacked shoes, sometimes surviving on cornmeal and beans alone. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making diseases more lethal. What outside observers labeled degeneracy was in fact the predictable result of deprivation. Yet resilience persisted. Oral histories record herbal knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters. Treatments for fevers, poultices for wounds, teas for coughs. Families pooled labor during harvests, ensuring survival through lean years. Storytelling preserved memory when schools excluded children. Survival itself became a form of quiet defiance against the forces of exclusion. Still, the genetic consequences could not be ignored. Interviews conducted in the 1960s with elderly descendants reveal memories of siblings born with deformities, cousins who died young, and neighbors marked by chronic illness. These testimonies align with modern genetic research, which confirms higher rates of homozygosity, identical gene pairs inherited from closely related parents, in Melungeon lineages. One particularly poignant case emerges from Hancock County, 1925, where a midwife recorded the birth of twin girls. One was stillborn, the other lived but with severe craniofacial abnormalities. The midwife's handwritten note, preserved in county archives, mentions that the parents were of the same blood as each other, an understated acknowledgement of endogamy. That surviving child, remembered only as Mary E., lived to adulthood but never spoke, her life confined to the cabin where she was born. Isolation bred inheritance, and inheritance bred stigma. Outsiders pointed to these medical anomalies as proof of inferiority, ignoring the systemic forces that created them. The investigation revealed the cycle. Exclusion forced endogamy, endogamy produced health issues reinforced exclusion. It was a loop few could escape. And yet, escape did occur. Some Melungeon men enlisted in the military, serving in the Civil War and later conflicts. Their service records list them variously as white, mulatto, or dark. Others migrated to Ohio or Indiana, where their children sometimes passed into white communities, their ancestry hidden. These departures reveal the fragility of racial boundaries, how identity could shift simply by moving across a county line. But for those who remained in the hollows, inheritance was destiny. The land tied them to place, and place tied them to one another. Children grew up knowing they would likely marry within their circle, that their bloodline carried both resilience and risk. Generations bore the weight of decisions not freely chosen, but imposed by society's rejection. This chapter of the Melungeon story is not merely genetic, it is systemic. The investigation revealed that isolation was not natural but enforced. It was the product of laws, prejudice, and exclusionary practices that hemmed families into mountain ridges and valleys. Inheritance was not only of genes but of stigma, passed as predictably as eye color or bone structure. In the shadow of those ridges, life continued. Babies were born, marriages celebrated, burials marked in overgrown cemeteries. Families endured. But the patterns of isolation and inheritance would haunt them for generations, shaping both their bodies and their place in history. If isolation created the conditions for survival, law institutionalized erasure. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Melungeons were not simply marginalized by rumor or mocked by folklore, they were legislated out of existence. The most decisive moment came with the passage of the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924. Drafted under the guidance of eugenicist Dr. Walter Plecker, the act established a rigid binary. Every citizen was to be classified as either white or colored. The law rejected intermediate categories, obliterating centuries of complex ancestry in favor of absolute separation. For the Melungeons, this law was devastating. Families long considered ambiguous were suddenly reclassified as colored. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, and school records were altered. Plecker himself, as Registrar of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, ordered clerks to strike through records that listed families as white if any suspicion of mixed ancestry existed. His office circulated lists of surnames, Collins, Goinses, Gibson among them, declaring them mongrel and subject to reclassification. The investigation revealed how bureaucratic decisions became weapons. A family who had lived for generations as legally white could wake up one day to find their children denied entry to white schools, their property rights challenged, and their marriages invalidated. The law did not simply police the present, it reached backward, rewriting ancestry itself. In Lee County, Virginia, petitions to school boards record parents pleading for their children to be admitted alongside white classmates. Their arguments were futile. The board cited the new law and the registrar's directives. These families are of mixed stock and shall attend colored schools. In practice, many communities lacked facilities for black students. Melungeon children were left with no schooling at all. Land rights were another casualty. In Hancock County, Tennessee, disputes over property often hinged on racial classification. If a family could be proven, or even alleged, to be colored, opponents argued they could not legally hold land in certain jurisdictions. Court minutes from the 1930s show repeated cases where Collins and Gibson descendants lost claims, not because of inadequate deeds, but because of their assigned racial category. Marriage was likewise weaponized. The act forbade unions across racial lines. For Melungeon families who had sometimes secured recognition as white, this meant abrupt invalidation. Couples found their marriages retroactively declared illegal, their children branded illegitimate in the eyes of the state. Medical records too bore the mark of erasure. Hospital registries from the 1930s list patients under racial designations that shifted depending on the attending physician. A Melungeon man might be recorded as white in one county hospital, and as colored in another, the inconsistency reflecting not identity but prejudice. The instability itself reinforced stigma. A people without fixed place, without stable recognition, trapped by a law that demanded certainty where none could exist. The investigation revealed that these laws were not isolated but part of a larger movement. The eugenics era sought to preserve racial purity, targeting not only African Americans but all who threatened the imagined boundaries of whiteness. Melungeons, with their ambiguous ancestry, became collateral damage in a campaign of systemic rewriting. Resistance existed, though often quietly. Some families altered records, claiming Portuguese or Native American ancestry to preserve whiteness in official documents. Others migrated north, where scrutiny was less intense, and passed into white communities under new names. But for many who remained in Appalachia, the erasure was total. Their children grew up denied the privileges their grandparents once tenuously held, their family histories marked with gaps where identities had been forcibly removed. By mid-century the effects were profound. Entire generations of Melungeon descendants grew up avoiding the word altogether, treating it as a slur. Documents show families insisting they were Indian or Portuguese, anything but Melungeon, because the law had made the label synonymous with loss. This was more than legal reclassification, it was cultural annihilation by statute. Through bureaucratic fiat, an entire people were pushed into invisibility. Their history was fragmented, their identity weaponized against them, their survival dependent on silence or reinvention. The erasure by law was perhaps the cruelest stage in the Melungeon saga. Where isolation had allowed a measure of autonomy, legislation stripped even that away. In the eyes of the state, they ceased to exist as who they were. What remained was stigma, carried forward in silence. By the mid-20th century, Melungeon identity was no longer just a matter of law and folklore, it became an object of medicine. Physicians, anthropologists, and geneticists turned their attention to the isolated hollows of Appalachia, not to offer care but to study. The Melungeons were dissected in reports, their bodies reduced to symptoms, their ancestry framed as pathology. Medical journals of the 1940s and 1950s contained scattered but telling references. One pediatrician, writing in 1949, described a cluster of unusual hereditary disorders among families in eastern Tennessee. The article mentioned congenital anomalies, polydactyly, and high infant mortality, without naming the families, but local records confirmed they belonged to Melungeon communities. The physician concluded these findings were the product of racial intermixture, reinforcing the old narrative of degeneration. No attention was paid to poverty, malnutrition, or the complete absence of modern healthcare in the region. The investigation revealed that this medical scrutiny was rarely neutral. Doctors and researchers arrived in the mountains already armed with the prejudices of their era. Eugenic thinking still lingered, even after the discrediting of formal eugenics programs. Appalachia itself was framed by outsiders as backward, and the Melungeons were portrayed as the most degraded within it. Their genetic distinctiveness was interpreted not as diversity, but as disease. Field studies by anthropologists in the 1950s and 1960s focused on blood typing and serological markers, claiming to uncover the racial origins of Melungeon families. These studies often drew blood without informed consent, treating participants less as patients than as specimens. Published results described Mediterranean admixture, Asiatic traits, or Negroid features as though these were diagnoses. Families, already stigmatized by law, now carried the added burden of medicalized suspicion. Case notes preserved in hospital archives provide intimate glimpses into this process. In one 1957 file from a Knoxville hospital, a Melungeon child admitted with pneumonia was described in detail: olive-skinned, dark straight hair, facial features not typical of white patients. The notation had no bearing on treatment, but it was preserved as part of the child's permanent medical record. Stigma was literally inscribed into healthcare. The consequences were tangible. When Melungeon patients sought medical care, they were often dismissed as incurable, their conditions attributed to tainted blood. Preventable illnesses went untreated. Malnutrition and parasitic infections, common in impoverished mountain communities, were left unaddressed because doctors framed them as genetic inevitabilities. What could have been solved with nutrition, sanitation, or basic antibiotics was instead catalogued as evidence of racial degeneracy. The investigation revealed an especially troubling trend. Melungeon bodies became sites of scientific curiosity without reciprocal care. University researchers collected data for dissertations and papers, yet local families continued to suffer in silence, untreated. When medical professionals left the hollows, the cabins remained cold, the pantries empty, the children sick. Knowledge was extracted, but aid was withheld. The medical gaze also intersected with the legal erasure already in place. Hospital clerks, following racial integrity laws, often marked Melungeon patients as colored. This classification affected access to segregated facilities, sometimes barring them from treatment in white hospitals or forcing them into overcrowded black wards. Health disparities widened, not because of inherent weakness, but because of systemic exclusion reinforced by medical authority. Even well-meaning researchers caused harm. Geneticists in the 1960s who sought to document the Melungeon's true ancestry often emphasized exotic origins: Turkish, Portuguese, North African, without reckoning with the stigma their reports deepened locally. To be labeled different was to be further marginalized. Science, in its attempt to clarify, reinforced division. For Melungeon families, the medical gaze became yet another form of surveillance. Their blood, their bodies, their children were interpreted through lenses of suspicion. Illnesses were not treated as human afflictions but as evidence of contaminated lineage. Medicine did not heal, it pathologized. Yet within the community, care persisted in other forms. Midwives delivered babies, herbal remedies were passed down, neighbors shared food during illness. Oral history preserves accounts of women who acted as healers, applying poultices, boiling teas, and offering prayers when no doctor would come. Their knowledge, though dismissed by outsiders as superstition, was the true medical support system for generations. The medical gaze left scars beyond the physical. Families learned to distrust hospitals, to avoid outside doctors, to remain silent about illness for fear of what records would say. This distrust lingers among descendants who recall parents' warning, "Don't let them write your name down, don't tell them where you're from." Thus, the mid-century chapter of the Melungeon story is marked not only by genetic inheritance, but by medical exploitation. Their bodies became texts in which prejudice was written, their illnesses transformed into symbols of difference. The investigation revealed that the greatest disease they endured was not hereditary, but systemic. A medical culture that mistook ancestry for ailment, and in doing so, failed to provide care. By the mid-20th century, the word Melungeon was so saturated with stigma that most families denied it outright. To be labeled Melungeon in Tennessee or Virginia was to be branded with shame, barred from schools, courts, and even churches. Generations grew up in silence, instructed by parents and grandparents never to speak the name. Yet in the shifting social landscape of the 1960s, 1980s, silence began to fracture. The civil rights movement reshaped conversations about race across the United States. While most attention focused on segregation in the South and systemic discrimination nationwide, the ripple effects reached even the isolated hollows of Appalachia. For Melungeon descendants, the era brought both peril and possibility. On one hand, renewed scrutiny of racial categories threatened to deepen stigma. On the other, broader social changes created space for hidden identities to surface. The investigation revealed that the first stirrings of reclamation were quiet, almost tentative. In small towns across eastern Tennessee, families began gathering oral histories, collecting church records, and tracing family trees. Much of this work was conducted in secrecy, for fear that public acknowledgement would reopen old wounds. But within kitchens and living rooms, elders spoke truths long buried. Yes, we are Melungeon. Our people have always been here. Genealogical research became a tool of survival and reclamation. In the 1970s, descendants pored over courthouse records, wills, and land deeds, piecing together lineages erased by law. These amateur historians faced systemic barriers, missing birth certificates, falsified records, and racial designations that shifted from one census to the next. Still, patterns emerged. The same surnames repeated across counties, their movements traced from Virginia to Tennessee to Kentucky. What courts and registrars had scattered, genealogists painstakingly reassembled. Oral testimonies provide some of the most vivid evidence of this era. A woman from Lee County, interviewed in 1975, recalled her grandmother's whispered instruction, "Don't ever say Melungeon outside this house. They'll never let you live it down." For her, reclaiming the name decades later was both defiance and healing. If we don't speak it, they win. They erase us. I'd rather carry the shame and know the truth. Community reunions marked another stage of reclamation. In the early 1980s, descendants of Collins, Gibson, and Goinses families began informal gatherings, often framed as genealogical meetings. Behind the study of family trees lay a deeper purpose: to break the silence. These reunions created spaces where people could share stories of exclusion and resilience, discovering that their experiences were not isolated but collective. The investigation revealed how powerful these first gatherings were. Attendees described the shock of hearing others articulate the same childhood experiences, being barred from schools, mocked as half-breeds, whispered about in church pews. What had once seemed like personal shame was reframed as systemic injustice. Out of shared memory, a sense of pride cautiously emerged. Academic interest also began to shift. In the 1960s and 1970s, scholars of Appalachian studies turned their attention to marginalized groups, challenging older narratives of a homogeneous white mountain culture. For the first time, serious research acknowledged Melungeons as a distinct community shaped by systemic exclusion, not simply a mystery race. Publications like the Appalachian Journal carried articles on mixed-race isolates, placing Melungeons within a broader pattern that included groups such as the Brass Ankles of South Carolina and the Redbones of Louisiana. Yet reclamation was not without resistance. Many descendants feared that embracing the Melungeon label would reopen old prejudices. In Hancock County, Tennessee, children still reported being taunted with the term on playgrounds. Some families refused to participate in reunions, insisting they were Portuguese or Indian to the end. The legacy of stigma was too deep for easy repair. Nevertheless, the seeds of change had been planted. By reclaiming the name, descendants were not only preserving history, they were challenging the very mechanisms of erasure. What the courts had denied, what doctors had pathologized, what neighbors had whispered in insult, families now began to speak with dignity. The investigation revealed that reclamation was never uniform, never simple. It was a process marked by conflict, ambivalence, and courage. For some, it meant embracing ancestry publicly for the first time. For others, it meant quietly preserving records for future generations, even if silence remained in their own lives. But the effect was cumulative. A people once forced into invisibility began to step, cautiously, into view. By the 1980s, the word Melungeon had begun its transformation. What was once an epithet slowly became a badge of endurance. Not yet pride, perhaps, but survival reclaimed as history. The tentative reclamation of the 1970s set the stage for a more public, organized revival in the final decade of the 20th century. By the 1990s, the Melungeon story was no longer confined to family kitchens or whispered oral histories. It emerged into conferences, associations, and even headlines, as descendants sought to transform stigma into heritage. The watershed moment came in 1997, when the first union of the Melungeon people convened in Wise, Virginia. Nearly 300 descendants gathered, representing surnames long tied to the Hollows: Collins, Gibson, Goinses, Minor, Mullins. For many, it was the first time they had spoken the word Melungeon publicly without fear. The event blended genealogy, scholarship, and cultural revival. Lectures addressed DNA testing, historical documentation, and Appalachian traditions. Elders recounted family stories once silenced. The mood was cautious but resolute, What had been an insult was becoming identity. The investigation revealed the significance of this gathering. For decades, Melungeons had lived under the burden of legal erasure and cultural stigma. By assembling in public, they reclaimed visibility. Newspaper coverage of the Union marked a turning point in representation. Instead of portraying them as a mystery race, journalists now reported on their resilience, their search for truth, and their insistence on dignity. The following year, the Melungeon Heritage Association (MHA) was formally established. Its mission was clear: to preserve history, promote scholarship, and connect descendants. The MHA organized annual conferences, sponsored research, and collected oral histories. In doing so, it shifted the narrative from pathology to pride. What courts and doctors had once used as evidence of inferiority became a story of survival against systemic erasure. DNA studies further altered the conversation. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, geneticists and genealogists began testing Melungeon lineages. Results confirmed what oral histories had long suggested. Melungeons were not the product of some exotic lost tribe, but of triracial ancestry, European, African, and Native American interwoven through centuries. These findings challenged the myths of degeneracy that had haunted the community. Instead, they situated the Melungeons within the broader history of America's racial complexity. But DNA brought new tensions. Some descendants embraced scientific validation, seeing it as proof against centuries of slander. Others resisted, fearing that reducing identity to genetic markers erased lived history. The investigation revealed a deeper truth. Heritage is not only written in chromosomes but also in stories, struggles, and survival. For the Melungeons, reclaiming identity meant balancing the scientific with the personal, the biological with the cultural. The public movement also brought scrutiny. Not all welcomed the revival. In some Appalachian towns, descendants who embraced Melungeon identity were met with suspicion from neighbors who insisted on silence. Local historians debated whether the term should even be used, some still regarding it as a slur. Within families, disagreements persisted. Older generations who had spent lifetimes avoiding the label sometimes clashed with younger descendants eager to claim it. Despite these tensions, the heritage movement gained momentum. Conferences drew participants from across the country. Academic studies expanded, reframing Melungeons not as anomalies but as part of a larger pattern of mixed-race isolates throughout the United States. Scholars compared them to the Lumbee of North Carolina, the Redbones of Louisiana, and the Brass Ankles of South Carolina. In this context, Melungeons were no longer alone but part of a wider story of communities marginalized by the rigidity of racial law. The investigation revealed how transformative this shift was. What had once been whispered shame became public discourse. The very word Melungeon, once hurled as insult, was printed proudly on banners at heritage gatherings, embroidered on quilts, and spoken into microphones by descendants who introduced themselves not as anomalies but as heirs to endurance. By the early 2000s, the Melungeon Heritage Association had built a network of archives, oral histories, and genealogical resources. Their work ensured that future generations would not have to rely on rumor or slander to understand their ancestry. Instead, they would find documents, DNA results, and testimonies that framed their heritage with dignity. This movement did more than restore pride. It confronted the systemic forces that had erased Melungeons from history. By gathering evidence, publishing scholarship, and telling their stories publicly, the heritage movement undermined centuries of legal, medical, and cultural exclusion. The erasure imposed by census takers, courts, and doctors was countered by reclamation, voice by voice, family by family. Thus, by the end of the 20th century, the Melungeons stood at a new threshold. Their identity, once stigmatized, was now claimed with strength. Their bloodlines, once pathologized, were reframed as testimony to resilience. What began as silence had become survival, and what had been survival was becoming pride. The story of the Melungeons is not a tale of disappearance, but of survival. Across 4 centuries, they endured misclassification by census takers, dispossession by courts, pathologization by doctors, and silencing by neighbors. Each institution played its part in erasure, yet the people themselves persisted, carrying their bloodlines through Appalachian hollows until the day they could speak their name again without shame. The investigation revealed that the greatest mystery was never where the Melungeons came from, it was why society refused to let them exist as they were. The answer lies in systemic prejudice. America's laws and institutions demanded rigid racial categories. A people who embodied complexity could not be tolerated. Their presence exposed the false simplicity of white and colored, and so the state chose to erase them. But history could not erase lived memory. Oral traditions carried fragments of truth through generations. Families told children that their ancestors were Portuguese sailors, or Native Americans, or dark whites. Each version was shaped by survival, a strategy to navigate laws that punished ambiguity. Beneath these adaptations, however, lay the unbroken fact of endurance. The legacy of the Melungeons carries lessons that extend far beyond Appalachia. They are part of a larger tapestry of triracial isolates across America. The Lumbee of North Carolina, the Redbones of Louisiana, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina. Each community reveals the same pattern. Families formed from mixed ancestry, marginalized by law, pathologized by medicine, and forced into silence. Their histories show how deeply institutions feared and punished complexity. Medical records demonstrate the consequences of enforced isolation. Inherited disorders compounded by poverty, misdiagnosed as proof of degeneracy. Court records show how property, votes, and marriages could be erased with the stroke of a judge's pen. School petitions reveal how children were denied education. Entire generations marked by illiteracy not from inability but from systemic exclusion. And yet, resilience emerges in equal measure. Genealogical work reclaimed erased lineages. Oral histories restored voices long silenced. DNA studies confirmed what families always knew, that their heritage was not aberrant but human, not degenerate but diverse. The heritage movement of the late 20th century turned shame into dignity, stigma into solidarity. Today, the Melungeon Heritage Association and similar groups ensure that this story will not vanish again. Conferences, publications, and archives provide descendants with tools their ancestors never had: proof of identity, recognition of resilience, acknowledgement of wrongs done. Where once children were told never to speak the name Melungeon, grandchildren now wear it as heritage. The mountains themselves remain silent witnesses. On Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, abandoned cemeteries hold the names of families once erased from records. Moss grows over stones where Collins, Gibson, and Goinses descendants rest. Yet their story is not buried. It has resurfaced, carried by descendants who refuse silence. The lesson of the Melungeons is clear. Erasure is not accidental, it is systemic. Silence is not natural, it is imposed. But survival is also systemic, carried in bloodlines, in whispered stories, in the determination of those who refuse to be forgotten. This case led to a broader recognition of how America's racial history is far more complex than laws admitted. It forced scholars to confront the violence of classification, the cruelty of medical prejudice, and the resilience of those who lived in between. The Melungeons remind us that identity cannot be legislated out of existence, nor pathologized into shame. It endures, waiting for the moment it can be reclaimed. In the end, the mystery of the Melungeons was never about their origins. It was about the silence imposed upon them and the courage required to break it. Their legacy teaches vigilance, to question official records, to listen to suppressed voices, to remember that history is often written not by those who lived it, but by those who sought to erase it. And so, from the hollows of Appalachia to the archives of universities, the Melungeon story continues, not as myth, not as pathology, but as testimony. A people hidden in plain sight, erased but not destroyed, silenced but not forgotten. Their endurance is their answer, and their legacy is a warning. When law, medicine, and prejudice conspire to erase, it is memory and resilience that restore.